The mysterious encounter. The crisp mountain air carried a sense of stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the crunch of gravel beneath Ethan's boots. He adjusted the strap of his pack and glanced up the narrow trail ahead. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the wind. It was the perfect time for him to enjoy the solitude of the mountains, far away from the noise of the cities below. As he rounded a bend in the path, Ethan froze. A figure stood a few meters ahead, hunched over and struggling to lift a large, oddly shaped pack. It was an alien woman, her features unfamiliar but not entirely intimidating. She was small and thin, her skin a pale lavender shade that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her clothing was simple, a long flowing robe adorned with intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. Strands of silver hair peeked out from under a hood that she had pulled low over her face. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to seeing anyone else this high up, let alone someone who appeared so out of place. She looked fragile, her thin arms shaking as she tried to balance the weight of her pack. For a moment, he debated whether he should just walk by. But his curiosity got the better of him. "Do you need help?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet surroundings. The woman stiffened and turned slowly to face him. Her eyes were a piercing gold, almost unnaturally bright. They studied him carefully, as if measuring his intentions. Ethan felt an odd chill run down his spine, but quickly shook it off. "I am fine," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. But as she tried to lift the pack again, it slipped from her grasp and tumbled onto the rocky path. She sighed, clearly frustrated. Ethan stepped forward cautiously. "Look, I don't mean to intrude, but that looks heavy. Let me help you carry it to wherever you're going." For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then, with a reluctant nod, she stepped aside. Ethan bent down to lift the pack and immediately realized why she had struggled. It was far heavier than it looked. The material inside shifted oddly, almost as if it were alive, but he dismissed the thought as his imagination. "What's in here?" "Rocks," he joked, trying to lighten the mood as he slung the pack over his shoulder. The woman didn't smile. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with," she said curtly. She started walking up the path without waiting for him. Ethan followed, his curiosity now fully piqued. "I'm Ethan, by the way. What's your name?" "Xira," she replied without turning around. "Well, Xira, you're a long way from civilization. What brings you up here?" "Quiet," she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't interested in conversation. They walked in silence for several minutes, the trail growing steeper and more uneven. Despite her earlier struggle, Xira moved with surprising agility, her steps light and deliberate. Ethan found himself watching her closely. There was something off about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As they climbed higher, Ethan spotted something in the distance. A group of figures was moving through the trees below them. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their movements were deliberate, almost predatory. "Hey, do you see that?" he asked, gesturing toward the figures. Xira stopped and turned to look. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of worry cross her face. She pulled her hood lower over her head and quickened her pace. "We need to move," she said sharply. Ethan frowned. "Why? Who are they?" "Trouble," she replied. "The kind you don't want to meet." Her urgency was infectious. Ethan tightened his grip on the pack and hurried to keep up. The figures below seemed to be gaining on them, their dark forms weaving through the forest with unsettling speed. "Are they after you?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. "Yes," Xira admitted. "And now, by helping me, they'll be after you too." Great, Ethan thought. He had just wanted a peaceful hike, and now he was being dragged into some alien's problems. But as they climbed higher, his frustration gave way to a growing sense of determination. Whatever Xira was caught up in, it was serious, and for some reason, he felt compelled to see it through. They reached a narrow ridge where the trail leveled out. Syrah paused, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze and saw a small cave entrance nestled among the rocks. "Inside," she ordered. Ethan didn't argue. As soon as they were inside, Syrah motioned for him to set the pack down. She began rummaging through it, pulling out strange, metallic objects covered in glowing symbols. Ethan watched in stunned silence. "What is all this?" he asked. "Tools," Syrah replied, "for protection." Before he could ask what she meant, a loud, guttural sound echoed from outside the cave. The figures had reached the ridge. Syrah stood, her frail appearance now replaced by an aura of calm authority. "Stay back," she said. "This is not your fight." Ethan's heart pounded as he watched her step toward the cave entrance. Whatever was about to happen, he had a feeling his peaceful hike was the least of his concerns now. Unseen power. The cold mountain wind howled outside the small cave, carrying with it a sense of impending danger. Ethan sat near the cave wall, his heart racing as his ears picked up the guttural growls of the figures approaching the ridge. Syrah stood at the entrance, her silhouette framed by the dying light of the sun. She had shed her earlier frailty, her posture straight and commanding. Ethan couldn't help but notice how calm she seemed, even as danger closed in. "Who are these people?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Syrah didn't look back. "Hunters," she said simply. "Hunters. Like bounty hunters." Syrah's golden eyes briefly flickered toward him, a hint of irritation crossing her face. "Something like that. They want what I carry, and they will not hesitate to kill for it." Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the pack sitting between them. He hadn't dared to ask before, but now his curiosity burned brighter than ever. "What's in that pack, Syrah? What's so important they'd come all the way out here?" For a moment, Syrah didn't answer. Then, in a voice as cold as the wind outside, she said something they should never have. Before Ethan could press her further, the first shadow appeared at the mouth of the cave. It was tall and humanoid, but its body was covered in dark, leathery scales that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and a low growl rumbled from its throat. Behind it, more figures emerged, each armed with jagged alien weapons. Ethan instinctively scrambled backward, his heart pounding. "We're outnumbered," he hissed. Syrah didn't move. She raised a hand, her fingers curling slightly as if commanding the air itself. The hunters stopped in their tracks, their glowing eyes narrowing as they regarded her. "Leave," Syrah said, her voice steady but laced with authority. "This is your only warning." The lead hunter stepped forward, bearing sharp, jagged teeth and a grin that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It raised its weapon, a long, curved blade that seemed to hum with energy, and pointed it at Syrah. "We don't take orders from relics," it hissed, its voice raspy and filled with malice. "Hand over the artifact, or we'll take it from your corpse." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Relic? Was that some kind of insult? And why did they want the artifact so badly? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. But before he could act, Syrah moved. It happened so fast that Ethan barely saw it. One moment, Syrah was standing still, her hood casting shadows over her face. The next, she was a blur of motion. She dashed toward the lead hunter, her hand striking out with impossible precision. There was a sharp crack as she disarmed it, the glowing blade clattering to the ground. The other hunters roared in anger and charge, but Syrah was faster. She twisted and turned with a grace that seemed unnatural, her robe billowing around her as she struck with deadly accuracy. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't need one. Her hands and feet were enough, each strike landing with devastating force. Ethan could only watch in stunned silence. The frail, elderly woman he had helped mere moments ago was now moving like a seasoned warrior, her every movement calculated and efficient. She seemed to anticipate the hunters' attacks before they even made them, dodging and countering with an ease that left Ethan breathless. But the hunters were relentless. One of them managed to circle around her, raising the heavy club-like weapon above its head. Ethan's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he grabbed a loose rock from the cave floor and hurled it with all his strength. The rock struck the hunter square in the head, causing it to stumble. Syrah took advantage of the distraction, delivering a swift kick that sent the creature sprawling. She glanced back at Ethan, her golden eyes flashing with something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps irritation. "Stay down," she ordered. "You're more useful alive." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched another rock, just in case. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Who was this woman? And how could someone so unassuming wield such incredible power? The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. The remaining hunters, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat. Zira stood at the cave entrance, her breathing steady despite the intense battle. She didn't chase them. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to send them fleeing into the shadows. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing with questions. What was that?" he finally managed to ask. Zira turned to face him, her golden eyes piercing in the dim light. "That," she said, her voice calm but firm, "was a glimpse of what I'm capable of. And a warning to you. If you continue to follow me, you'll face far worse than this." Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse still racing. Part of him wanted to turn back, to leave this strange woman and her dangerous mission behind. But another part, a stronger part, refused to let go of the mystery. He had seen something extraordinary tonight, something that defied explanation, and he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady despite the fear still coursing through him. "Whatever this is, I want to see it through." Zira regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, she turned back toward the trail. "Then keep up," she said. And with that, she stepped into the darkness, leaving Ethan no choice but to follow. The warrior's identity. The mountain trail stretched out before them, shrouded in darkness. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the faint howl of the wind through the jagged peaks. Ethan's heart still raced from the encounter in the cave, and his thoughts churned with unanswered questions. He stole a glance at Syrah, who walked a few paces ahead, her movements calm and deliberate. If the earlier fight had taken any toll on her, she didn't show it. "Okay," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "I think it's time you start explaining." Zira didn't slow down or look back. "Explaining what?" she asked, her tone flat. "Everything," Ethan exclaimed, his voice echoing slightly in the empty expanse around them. "Who were those guys? What do they want? And what the hell was that back there? You fought them off like some kind of superhero." Zira sighed, her golden eyes flicking briefly toward the horizon. "They are mercenaries," she said simply, "hired by people who believe I have something valuable." Ethan frowned. "And do you?" "That depends on who you ask," Syrah replied cryptically. Ethan stopped walking, his frustration boiling over. "You can't keep brushing me off like this. I just watched you take down an entire group of armed hunters with your bare hands. You owe me an explanation." Zira finally stopped and turned to face him. The moonlight illuminated her features, and for the first time, Ethan noticed the faint scars that traced across her lavender skin. Her expression was unreadable, but her golden eyes held a weight that made him feel small and insignificant. "You think you want answers," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But the truth is not something you're prepared to hear." Ethan squared his shoulders, his frustration giving way to determination. "Try me." For a long moment, Zira said nothing. Then, with a slight nod, she gestured for Ethan to follow her. They moved off the main trail and into a narrow ravine, the walls of rock towering above them like silent sentinels. At the base of the ravine, Zira stopped and knelt by a small, bubbling stream. "Where I come from," she began, her voice softer now, "is a place you will never see. My people call it Silaris. It is a world of warriors, a place where strength is valued above all else. For centuries, we fought among ourselves, Our clans locked in endless battles for dominance. It was a way of life, brutal, but necessary. Ethan crouched nearby, listening intently. He had never heard of Tyleris, but the galaxy was vast, and humanity's knowledge of it was still limited. I was born into one of the strongest clans. Shira continued. We trained from birth to fight, to survive. By the time I was your age, I had already seen more death than you can imagine. She paused, her gaze distant. But I was good at it, too good. They began to call me the Silent Blade. I led my clan to victory in countless battles, carving a path through our enemies. Ethan's mouth went dry. The frail, elderly woman he had met on the trail was starting to sound like a legend. So, you were a warrior. Xira gave a bitter laugh. I was more than that. I was a weapon. My clan used me to crush their rivals, to expand their power. But the more victories I won, the more I began to see the cost. The lives lost, the family shattered. It began to weigh on me. I started to question everything. Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity growing. What happened? Xira's expression darkened. I made a choice. I turned my back on my clan, on the bloodshed. I left Tyleris, vowing never to raise a blade again. I became a wanderer, searching for a way to atone for the lives I had taken. She gestured toward the pack lying between them. That artifact is part of my atonement. It is a relic from an ancient civilization, one my people conquered long ago. It has the power to destroy, but also to heal. I intend to ensure it is used for the latter. Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. And those hunters, they wanted to destroy. Most likely, Xira said, or to sell it to the highest bidder. Either way, I cannot let them have it. Ethan was silent for a moment, absorbing everything she had said. So what's the plan? He finally asked. Just keep running until they give up. Xira shook her head. No, we are not running. There is someone I must meet, an ally who can help us. But the path ahead is dangerous, and the hunters will not stop. If you choose to stay, you will be putting your life at risk. Ethan thought about the peaceful hike he had planned, about the safety of the cities far below. But something about Xira's story, about her mission, stirred something in him. He couldn't walk away, not now. I'm not leaving, he said firmly. Whatever danger's coming, I'll face it with you. Xira studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes searching his face. Finally, she gave a slight nod. Very well, she said. But remember this, human. Courage alone will not keep you alive. You must be ready to fight. As they set off again, the moonlight casting long shadows on the rocky path, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. One thing was certain, his life would never be the same. The pursuit begins. The quiet of the mountain night was deceiving. Ethan could feel it, a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. He trudged behind Xira, the pack heavier on his shoulders with every step. The earlier revelations about her life, her people, and the artifacts still swirled in his mind, but there was little time to process. The hunters weren't far behind, and the narrow path ahead offered few places to hide. Are you sure we're going the right way? Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. Xira glanced back at him, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The path is treacherous but necessary. If we keep moving, we'll reach the rendezvous point before dawn. And what if we don't? Ethan pressed, the unease evident in his tone. Then we fight, Xira said matter-of-factly, turning her gaze back to the trail. Her calm demeanor did little to ease his nerves. As they ascended, the trail grew steeper, the rocks slick with frost. The cold bit at Ethan's fingers and face, but he didn't complain. His thoughts were consumed by the sounds behind them, subtle but persistent. A snapping twig, the crunch of gravel, the faint hum of alien energy weapons. The hunters were closing in, their movements too calculated to be random. Why don't they just attack us already? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. They are waiting for the right moment, Zyra replied, her voice low. They know I am dangerous, and they will not risk a direct confrontation unless they are certain they can win. Her words did little to reassure him. Ethan tightened his grip on the strap of the pack, his pulse quickening. He wasn't a soldier or a fighter. He was just an ordinary guy who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation, and yet there was no turning back now. They reached a narrow ledge that hugged the side of a steep cliff. The drop below was dizzying, the shadows of the valley stretching endlessly into the darkness. Zyra paused, her sharp gaze scanning the horizon. "This is where they will strike," she said calmly, as though discussing the weather. Ethan blinked. "What? How do you know?" "Because I would," Zyra replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "It is the perfect ambush point. Limited space, no cover, no room to maneuver. They will use the terrain to their advantage." Ethan's stomach churned. "Great. So what's the plan?" Zyra stepped onto the ledge, her movements confident and precise. "We keep moving. And when they attack, you stay behind me." "Stay behind you," Ethan repeated, incredulous. "I'm not exactly a fan of hiding while you do all the work." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "Do you know how to fight off trained mercenaries armed with plasma weapons?" "Well, no," Ethan admitted, his cheeks flushing. "But then stay behind me," Zyra said firmly. "Your job is to keep the artifacts safe. If something happens to me, you must deliver it to the contact at the summit." Ethan wanted to argue but stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. There was no room for debate. With a reluctant nod, he followed her onto the ledge, the cold wind whipping around them. They had only made it halfway across when the attack began. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by a blinding flash of light. Ethan ducked instinctively as a plasma bolt slammed into the rock wall beside him, sending shards of stone flying. He stumbled, barely catching himself before tumbling over the edge. "Stay down," Zyra shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Ethan dropped to his knees, clutching the pack to his chest. He watched in awe as Zyra moved like a shadow, her robe billowing around her as she darted across the narrow ledge. The first hunter emerged from the darkness, a hulking figure wielding a glowing energy blade. Zyra didn't hesitate. With a fluid motion, she disarmed him, her hand striking with impossible speed. The blade clattered to the ground and tumbled into the abyss. More hunters appeared, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. They attacked in unison, their movements coordinated and precise. But Zyra was faster. She ducked, dodged, and countered with a precision that seemed almost otherworldly. Her hands and feet were her only weapons, yet they were more than enough. Ethan could only watch, his heart pounding as the fight unfolded before him. Zyra was outnumbered, but she didn't falter. Her movements were a blur, each strike calculated and devastating. It was as if she could anticipate her opponent's every move, her golden eyes scanning their attacks before they even began. One of the hunters broke away from the group, his gaze fixed on Ethan. The mercenary raised a weapon, a jagged rifle that hummed with lethal energy. Ethan froze, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no training, nothing that could stop what was coming. Before the hunter could fire, Zyra was there. She grabbed the rifle and wrenched it from his hands, using the weapon's own momentum to knock him off balance. With a swift kick, she sent him tumbling over the edge, his scream swallowed by the abyss below. The remaining hunters hesitated, their confidence shaken. Zyra straightened, her breathing steady despite the battle. She fixed them with a cold, unyielding stare. "Leave," she commanded, her voice low and dangerous, "or share his fate." The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. One by one, they retreated into the shadows, their shapes blending into the darkness. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He searched for the right word but came up empty. That was insane. Zyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is only the beginning," she said. "The closer we get to the summit, the more desperate they will become. Ethan nodded, his hands still trembling. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: he was in way over his head. And yet, despite the danger, a small part of him couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration. "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "We don't have much time." With that, she turned and continued up the trail, leaving Ethan to gather his courage and follow. The night stretched on, the wind carrying with it the promise of more challenges to come. The battle on the bridge. The trail narrowed into a thin bridge of rock, spanning a deep chasm that seemed bottomless. The wind howled through the gap, sending loose pebbles tumbling into the void below. Ethan hesitated at the edge, staring at the treacherous crossing. His palms were slick with sweat, and the weight of the artifact-laden pack on his back made him feel dangerously unbalanced. "This is the only way across?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. Zira, standing ahead on the bridge, glanced back at him. Her golden eyes gleamed in the dim light of dawn breaking over the mountains. "Unless you've learned to fly, yes," she said dryly. "Keep moving. We don't have time." Ethan swallowed hard and took a tentative step onto the bridge. It was narrower than he liked, and the sharp gusts of wind did little to help his confidence. He kept his eyes fixed on Xira, who moved with the grace and confidence of someone who had made similar crossings 1,000 times before. They were halfway across when the first plasma shot screamed through the air, slamming into the rock just inches from Ethan's feet. The blast sent chunks of stone flying, and the bridge trembled beneath him. "They're here," Ethan shouted, instinctively ducking. Xira turned sharply, her gaze scanning the cliffs on either side of the chasm. Shadows shifted among the jagged rocks, revealing the hunters who had pursued them relentlessly. One of them stepped forward, a towering figure clad in dark, angular armor. He wielded a massive plasma blade that hissed with energy, its blue glow reflecting off the rock walls. "Give us the artifact," the armored hunter demanded, his voice amplified by a helmet that distorted it into a menacing growl, "or you won't leave this bridge alive." Xira stepped forward, placing herself between Ethan and the hunters. Her stance was calm, but her voice carried the weight of steel. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said. "Leave now, and I'll let you walk away." The armored hunter laughed, a low guttural sound. Brave words for someone so outnumbered. "But you're right about one thing. We do know what we're dealing with. You, Xira, the Silent Blade. The galaxy hasn't forgotten you." Ethan's breath hitched. They knew her name, her reputation. That meant they had come prepared. The hunter raised his plasma blade, the glow intensifying as he pointed it at Sarah. "Let's see if the stories are true." Before Ethan could react, the hunter charged. His heavy boots pounded against the bridge, the vibration resonating through the narrow rock span. Xira moved to meet him, her robe billowing like a shadow as she leaped into action. The clash was immediate and violent. The plasma blade hissed as it sliced through the air, but Xira dodged with impossible speed, her movements fluid and precise. She struck back with her bare hands, targeting the weak points in the hunter's armor. Sparks flew as her strikes connected, forcing him to step back. "Stay down, Ethan," Xira shouted without turning, her voice cutting through the chaos. Ethan ducked behind a jagged outcrop at the edge of the bridge, clutching the pack to his chest. His heart pounded as he watched the fight unfold. Xira was incredible. Every motion a calculated blend of offense and defense. But the hunter was relentless, his heavy armor and weapon giving him an edge in power. The other hunters, emboldened by their leader's charge, began to move across the bridge. Ethan's pulse quickened. If they joined the fight, Xira would be overwhelmed. Desperation overtook him. He searched the area for anything he could use, a rock, a stick, anything. His hand closed around a jagged piece of stone. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The lead hunter swung his plasma blade in a wide arc, aiming to knock Xira off the bridge. She ducked under the attack, her hand darting out to strike the joint of his knee. The hunter stumbled, giving Sira an opening to drive a sharp kick into his chest. He staggered back, but the other hunters were closing in fast. Ethan gritted his teeth and hurled the rock with all his strength. It struck one of the approaching hunters square in the helmet, causing him to falter. It wasn't much, but it bought Sira a second of breathing room. She capitalized on the distraction, spinning to face the advancing group. With a fluid motion, she grabbed the plasma blade from the stunned leader's hand and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the others to retreat. "Get across the bridge," Sira commanded, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated, torn between following her orders and staying to help, but the look in her eyes left no room for argument. He turned and ran, his steps unsteady as the bridge trembled under the weight of the battle. Behind him, the clash of plasma and the cries of the hunters echoed through the chasm. He reached the other side and turned just in time to see Sira deliver a devastating blow to the leader, sending him crashing to his knees. She swung the plasma blade with precision, cutting the supports of the bridge. The hunters froze as the bridge began to collapse beneath them. Sira sprinted toward Ethan, leaping just as the rock span gave way. For a heart-stopping moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't make it, but her hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the cliff as the bridge crumbled into the void below. Ethan rushed forward, grabbing her arm and pulling with all his strength. Sira scrambled onto solid ground, breathing heavily but otherwise unscathed. "Thanks," Ethan said, panting. Sira pushed herself to her feet, her expression unreadable. "Don't thank me yet. This is far from over." She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the summit loomed in the distance. The battle had bought them time, but their enemies were still out there, and the hardest part of their journey was yet to come. The truth revealed. The summit loomed closer, its jagged silhouette cutting against the pale light of dawn. Ethan could feel the cold seeping through his jacket, the thin mountain air biting at his lungs. He trudged behind Sira, his muscles aching from the relentless climb. The encounter on the bridge had left him shaken, but the artifact in the pack on his back felt heavier with every step, a constant reminder of what they were risking their lives for. "Are we close?" he asked, his voice strained. "Close enough," Sira replied, her tone unreadable. She didn't look back, her golden eyes fixed on the path ahead. Ethan had 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, but he didn't know where to start. Finally, he decided on the one that burned the brightest. "Why is this artifact so important? You've told me bits and pieces, but I still don't understand what makes it worth dying for." Sira slowed her pace, her shoulders tensing slightly. For a moment, Ethan thought she might brush him off again. But then she stopped, turning to face him. The lines of her face seemed deeper now, her expression heavy with a mix of resolve and sorrow. "You've earned the truth," she said quietly. "But I warn you, it may change how you see me." Ethan set the pack down and nodded, bracing himself. "I'm listening." Sira stepped closer, her voice low as she began to speak. "The artifact is called the Core of Elis. It is a remnant of a civilization that existed long before your kind or mine. A civilization that mastered the art of balancing destruction and creation. The core holds unimaginable power. In the wrong hands, it could wipe out entire planets with a single command. But in the right hands," she paused, her gaze distant, "it can heal. It can restore life, mend what was broken. It could bring hope to the hopeless." Ethan frowned, his curiosity piqued. "Then why do people want to use it as a weapon?" "Because destruction is easy," Sira said bitterly. "And power corrupts even the best intentions. My people, the Silurans, discovered the core centuries ago. We were already a warlike race, and its destructive potential only made things worse. The wars that followed nearly wiped us out." Her voice grew quieter, tinged with regret. "I was one of those who used it. I wielded its power in battle, thinking I was fighting for the greater good. But all I brought was death. I've spent the last 2 decades trying to atone for what I did." Ethan's throat tightened, He hadn't expected this, a confession of guilt from someone who seemed so unshakable. And now, he asked softly, "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to destroy it," Zira said, her voice firm. "No one should have that kind of power. Not my people, not yours, not anyone. The only way to ensure it's never used again is to end it." Ethan blinked, startled. "Destroy it? But you said it could heal, restore life. Don't you think it's worth trying to use it for good?" Zira's golden eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable. "You think I haven't considered that? Every day, I ask myself if there's another way. But I've seen what happens when people chase that kind of hope. They twist it, corrupt it. Even if I had the strength to use it for good, there's no guarantee it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands later." Ethan looked away, his mind racing. Part of him understood her reasoning, but another part couldn't let go of the idea that the core could be a force for good. He thought about all the suffering he'd seen in his own life. Wars, famine, disease. Couldn't something like the core change all that? Before he could speak, Zira's posture stiffened, her head tilted slightly, her gaze darting toward the ridgeline above them. "They're here." Ethan's heart sank. "The hunters." "No," Zira said grimly. "Worse." A figure emerged from the mist, stepping onto the path ahead. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his armor gleaming like polished obsidian. Unlike the other hunters, this one carried no visible weapons, but there was something about him, a presence that made the air feel heavier. "Zira," the figure said, his voice smooth and cold. "It's been a long time." Zira's expression hardened. "Calton." Ethan glanced between them, his confusion mounting. "Who's this guy?" "Calton," Zira said without looking at him, "is a Xylaran enforcer, sent by my people to retrieve the core. He's not here to negotiate." "Correct," Calton said, a faint smile playing at his lips. "The council grows impatient, Zira. Hand over the core, and I'll ensure your death is quick." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Death? He's here to kill you. It's the only way they can be certain I won't interfere," Zira said, her tone flat. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate. "But if you think I'll let you take the core, you've forgotten who I am." Calton's smile widened. "I could never forget. That's why they sent me." The tension snapped like a taut wire, and Calton lunged. Zira moved to intercept, her hands a blur as she blocked his strikes. The two clashed with breathtaking speed, their movements almost too fast for Ethan to follow. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching the pack. He felt utterly out of his depth, a helpless bystander in a battle that seemed otherworldly. But then his gaze fell on the core, its faint glow visible through the fabric of the pack. He hesitated, his mind racing. Could he use it? Could he help Zira by activating the core's power, or would that only make things worse? As the fight raged on, Ethan realized he had to make a choice, and quickly. The final stand. The summit was a battlefield, the crisp mountain air charged with tension. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he clutched the pack containing the core of Alice, its faint glow spilling through the seams. The ground beneath his boots felt unsteady, as if the mountain itself recoiled from the chaos unfolding. Zira and Calton circled each other in the center of the plateau, their movements precise and deliberate. The morning light glinted off Calton's obsidian armor, making him appear almost otherworldly. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, his eyes locked onto Zira like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've lost, Zira," Calton said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Surrender the core and accept your fate. You cannot protect it forever." Zira stood her ground, her robes torn and dusted with dirt, but her golden eyes burned with defiance. "I didn't come this far to give up now," she replied. Her voice was steady, unwavering. Ethan stood at the edge of the battlefield, gripping the pack as if it were his lifeline. He wanted to help, to do something, but he was out of his depth. The artifact hummed faintly, almost as if it were alive, and he could feel its energy pulsing through the fabric. "Ethan," Xura called, her voice snapping him out of his thoughts. "Stay back. Whatever happens, do not let him take the core." He nodded, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how he could stop someone like Colton, but he knew he had to try. The fight began with explosive force. Colton lunged, his fists encased in glowing energy that crackled with lethal power. Xura met him head-on, her movements fluid and precise. She struck with speed and accuracy, targeting the weak points in his armor. The two warriors clashed like titans, their blows sending shockwaves across the summit. Ethan watched in awe, unable to look away. Xura moved like a dancer, her every motion a blend of grace and deadly intent. But Colton was relentless, his strikes powerful enough to crack stone. He fought with the calculated brutality of someone who had been trained to kill without hesitation. For a moment, it seemed like Xura was holding her own. She dodged a devastating punch and countered with a strike that sent Colton stumbling. But the fight was taking its toll. Her breathing grew labored, and her movements, while still precise, were slower than before. "You've grown weak," Colton sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. The great silent blade, reduced to running and hiding. Pathetic. Xura didn't reply. Instead, she pressed the attack, her strikes growing fiercer. But Colton was prepared. He deflected her blows with ease and delivered a crushing kick that sent her sprawling. Ethan's heart sank as Xura hit the ground, her body motionless for a moment that felt like an eternity. Colton loomed over her, his energy-encased fists glowing brighter. "This ends now," Colton said, raising his arm for the final blow. "No," Ethan shouted, stepping forward instinctively. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't stand by any longer. Gripping the pack tightly, he activated the core. A surge of energy exploded from the artifact, enveloping the summit in a blinding light. Ethan felt the power coursing through him, a mix of awe and terror, as the core's ancient energy pulsed in response to his touch. The glow intensified, forming a barrier of shimmering light between Xura and Colton. Colton staggered back, shielding his eyes. "What are you doing?" he snarled. Ethan stepped forward, his fear replaced by a newfound resolve. "You're not taking this," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you." Colton's eyes narrowed, and he lunged at Ethan, his fists raised. But before he could strike, the core's energy flared, sending a wave of force that knocked him to the ground. The artifact hummed louder, its light growing brighter. Xura groaned and pushed herself to her feet, her gaze locking onto Ethan. "The core. What did you do?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, panic creeping into his voice. "It just reacted." Xura's expression shifted, a mix of urgency and determination. "The core is responding to you. It recognizes your intent. You need to focus. Guide its power." "Guide it?" Ethan repeated, his hands shaking. "How?" "Think about what you want," Xura said, her voice urgent. "Not just for now, but for the future. The core will respond to your will." Ethan closed his eyes, his mind racing. He thought about the destruction the core had caused in the past, the lives lost, and the chaos it had wrought. But he also thought about its potential, the hope it could bring, the lives it could save. He didn't want more death. He wanted an end to the violence. The core's light intensified, enveloping the entire summit in a radiant glow. Colton shielded his face, shouting something Ethan couldn't hear over the hum of energy. Xura stepped beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the light. "You've chosen well," she said softly. The energy erupted in a final, brilliant flash, and when the light faded, Colton was gone. The summit was silent, the wind carrying away the echoes of the battle. The core rested in Ethan's hands, its glow now dim and serene. Xura placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression weary but grateful. "You've done something I couldn't," she said. "You've given the core a purpose beyond destruction." Ethan looked down at the artifact, his heart heavy. "What now?" "Now," Zira said, "we make sure it never falls into the wrong hands again." Together, they descended the mountain, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope.